button. Today's presentation is Effectively Developing Cutting-Edge Mobile Tools for Market Access. Today's speaker is Atlanta Kassatly. Atlanta joined Certara in 2013, where she is currently a Vice President of Consulting. She earned a first-class honors in biological sciences from the University of Edinburgh, and also a master's in public health economics from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Before joining Certara, Atlanta worked in Senegal for a non-governmental organization working to build sustainable and self-reliant societies through informal education programs. Atlanta, welcome to today's presentation. I'll now turn it over to her to begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So yes, I run one of the consulting teams here at Certara, and my team is specifically responsible for developing interactive mobile value communication tools for our clients. So we have our consultants, they have backgrounds in biology, health economics, medicine, and they bring their subject matter expertise and an understanding of the stories that our clients are trying to tell. And then we have our designers who bring their expertise in graphic and user interface design, and are experts in presenting content in impactful, intuitive, and visually attractive ways. Our clients come from pharma, medical devices, and diagnostics, and for them we've developed a wide variety of tools. So those include interactive budget impact models and cost effectiveness models, or other dynamic cost calculators, data-driven presentations, for example, benchmarking tools that use Medicare and reimbursement data to compare specific facilities to state and national averages, and interactive value stories and IGVDs that can be used to present volumes of typically static content in interactive, user-friendly, and more accessible ways than their PowerPoint or Word document-based counterparts. So before we get into the core content of the webinar itself, I'd like to find out a little bit more about who we have in the audience today. So I have two questions for you on Mentimeter. If you haven't joined already, please do using the access code 62162. And my first question is, which area do you work in? So market access, HEOR, commercial, or other? And I'll just give everyone some time to respond. Okay, interesting. It looks like the majority of our participants are working in market access, one in HEOR, and one in commercial. Oh, still some responses going. Okay, I'll give it a few more moments. Okay, yeah, majority from market access. That is what I would expect. And if we move on to the, or not, maybe we'll wait a few more moments. Yep, if we move on to the next question. So what do you primarily use mobile tools to present? So are you primarily using these mobile tools to present interactive versions of your budget impact models, your cost effectiveness models, or other dynamic calculators? Are you using them to present value communication content, IGVDs, for example? Perhaps you aren't actually using mobile tools right now? Okay, so about 25% of the audience are not actively using mobile tools. Well, hopefully I will be able to change your mind about how they could be impactful and useful in engaging payers. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Suzanne. Today I'd like to cover three main sections. The first is why we should even use mobile tools for engagement. Why not use the PowerPoints and Excel models that we already have? Then we'll go on to look at best practices for tool development. And I'll walk you through the tried and tested process that we use when we develop tools for our clients. And this includes defining the communication objective and the supporting value story, drafting the storyboard that serves as a sketch for the tool, and streamlining the supporting model and other materials. And then we'll also look at some common challenges that we encounter, and those include making the right user interface and user experience choices, managing rollout, managing localizations and country adaptations, and finally building a tool that can withstand the constant changes that we see in medical and regulatory fields. So, why should we use mobile tools for customer engagement? Why do we need to go to all the extra trouble of developing a tool when we already have, let's say, a perfectly good Excel model or a perfectly good PowerPoint? Well, versus static slide decks and Excel-based models, mobile tools are a great way to engage payers and providers with relevant, personalized content. So, for a given drug or device, customers want to see the clinical and economic impact in their own population, using their data, using their assumptions, and all of the parameters that are relevant to their specific setting. By integrating Excel models or data sets into our tools and adding user-editable inputs to the interface, we can perform live calculations and visualize data and results that is tailored to each customer. This means not only that the analysis is relevant to the given client, but also that it gives them some ownership of the data and the results that are being generated. We're much more likely to buy into a scenario or an idea if we help to create it. Mobile tools also provide a means to present complex concepts and data in a format that can be easily understood by non-experts. So the detailed evidence that we generate from economic and clinical studies can be difficult to understand if you're not an expert in the field. And while Excel is an extremely powerful tool for all kinds of models, decision makers aren't always comfortable with this form of presentation. They might have concerns about its transparency, and even the field force themselves who are presenting the content might be uncomfortable with it. And even for simpler content like a PowerPoint-based value story, mobile tools can be a better alternative. The information can be presented in visually attractive ways. You can add interactive elements and animated charts, and these can help to engage and retain customer attention to a much greater degree than a static PowerPoint with bullets would. With this type of dynamic presentation, where you can instantly see how changing an input impacts the results, you can better grasp what the data means. So I just have a very, very simple example here. On the left, we have an Excel-based engagement tool. We've formatted it nicely, we've added some colors, we've removed the ugly Excel grid lines, but I'm sure you'd agree that it's still not very engaging. And on the right, we have a mobile-based version of the same content. And even with very minimal styling, I'm sure you'd agree that it does a much better job of communicating the data surrounding dementia in England. And it's much easier to pick out the key points that are important. So why else should we use mobile tools for customer engagement? Well, as we just discussed, Excel can be an unwieldy platform for value communication, while tools can help to foster field force engagement with content that's easy to use and adapt. Let's face it, if your field teams don't feel comfortable with material, they simply won't present it. And the last thing we want is to invest a lot of time and a lot of resources in building an Excel BIM or a complex cost effectiveness model for it to sit on the shelf. With mobile tools, we can also build in CLM and analytics, which can provide customer insights on areas of specific interest, some objections that they might have, and of course, all of this we can use to guide future material and tool development. And finally, generally speaking, mobile tools offer a means to maintain centralized control and consistency across versions. So this means that we can be sure that all of our teams are presenting the same and most up-to-date content. For our platform specifically, field teams only need one application to securely access all tools. Sharing tools is very easy, and built-in version control lets you revert tools to an earlier version and roll back development if needed. Now, I just have one last question before we move on to looking at how we develop tools in practice. So in addition to sending the field force out with interactive tools to engage with payers and providers, we've seen an increasing trend in putting mobile tools directly in the hands of the audience. For example, sharing a dosing calculator directly with the healthcare provider rather than presenting it over the course of a discussion with a CAM. So I would be interested to know if members of the audience are interested in or actively putting tools in the hands of their customers. So that looks like an overwhelming yes. Okay, great. So if we now go back to the presentation. So for us, when we develop tools for our clients, we always follow the same overarching process. And the first step for us is always to define the communication objective and supporting value story. So the communication objective. This is the single key sentence that we want our customers to remember. It targets a well-defined group of stakeholders. For example, payers interested in the options for blood glucose monitoring in diabetic patients, or hospital clinicians making decisions about which drug to use for heart failure patients. And generally speaking, it touches on the what, the how, and the why they should consider a specific drug or device. So we have an example communication objective down here at the bottom. For patients with type 2 diabetes, drug X can improve blood glucose control, resulting in fewer ER visits and cost savings. So the what here is drug X. The how is, well, it improves blood glucose control. And the why, well, it can potentiate fewer ER visits and cost savings. Supporting the communication objective, we have the value story. Now, this is composed of a series of evidence-based messages, for example, with information taken from the literature and the supporting Excel models, and it follows a logical order with each message building on or adding to the last. Generally speaking, we like to use a single view or page per message as this helps to focus attention. Now, when we develop tools for our clients, this value story writing stage is the one that takes us the most time. Reducing all of the information about a product to a series of clear, simple messages that resonate in the field is actually really hard work. And one of the tactics that we tend to employ is to try to see the product from the stakeholders' perspective and their economic environment. What are they interested in? At the end of the day, it's them that we need to convince, and looking at everything in the context of their remit will help to ensure that the story is relevant and resonates with them. So before we get into looking at a specific example of a value story, I'd like to flag some principles that should always guide its development. So the first, and probably the most important, is to think of your audience. Who are they? What are their educational and professional backgrounds? What level of scientific and quantitative detail are they likely to be comfortable with? A GP or a surgeon is likely to be more comfortable with the clinical information about a given product or disease than, say, a facility manager or a funding authority. And likewise, the latter are probably going to be more interested in the economic outcomes and potential cost savings of the product than a healthcare provider would typically be. We also want to be mindful of any objections or preconceptions that they might have about the disease, the proposed treatment, or the assumptions that we're making. And perhaps we want to incorporate ways to mitigate these. And finally, we want to ask, what is the ultimate conclusion that we want the audience to draw? Clients are typically short on time, and so it's important to create presentations with clear, tailored messages that are as simple as possible while remaining accurate and credible. The second overarching principle is that we only want to show what's really necessary. So we only want to present content that's relevant to the story, and generally we want to layer content so that additional evidence can be presented on demand. For example, putting the detailed information about a study in a supplementary pop-up, or putting additional information on adverse events, let's say, in secondary tabs. And finally, we want to help our audience out. So some things to remember here are that consistency is key. We want to help the audience to anticipate what's coming next and minimize the effort that it takes to follow the presentation by keeping sentence and messaging structure consistent. Generally speaking, less is more. So wherever possible, we should be using short sentences and fewer words to help our audience to focus. Now here we have a very simple example of a value story that goes with the communication objective that I showed you earlier. So at a high level, we have our key messages on the left-hand side, and we have the data that we're going to present alongside them. So maybe that's coming from the literature, that's coming from our Excel model. And if we just look briefly at the kind of structure, we first look at the burden of disease in our payer's specific plan. Then we go on to talk about how maintaining blood glucose control is an important part of containing the costs associated with type 2 diabetes. We go on to show that drug X can actually improve blood glucose control, and that with that improvement, we can expect to see fewer hospitalizations and associated cost savings, and potentially a total annual cost of somewhere in the range of, in this instance, $1 million. And then maybe we want to end with a nice summary slide that brings in all of those data points and key conclusions in a nice clean view. So if we look at how we might implement that in practice, here we have the first page, our key messages at the top. Type 2 diabetes currently affects 1,220 people in your plan. And we have the payer's specific inputs here on the left-hand side, so their total plan population, their prevalence of type 2 diabetes, their incidence. And then on the right, we have a nice visualization of the type 2 patients that they have in their plan over time up until 2024 in terms of new and current cases. Then perhaps we want to bring in some information from the literature that talks about how type 2 diabetes is represents an extremely high cost in the US, and maybe specifically that hospitalization and medication costs to treat complications resulting from poor blood glucose control can account for up to 60% of these. So we're setting the scene. And then we go on to say that patients with uncontrolled blood glucose levels experience 50% more hospitalizations than those with adequate control. So here we might want to bring in some data from the clinical trials that we've done on our drug, showing perhaps the percentage time spent in the optimal blood glucose range, and how for patients treated with drug X, they spend a significantly greater proportion of time in the optimal range than patients treated with the current standard of care. And then what that looks like in terms of the number of hospitalizations per patient, and again showing that compared to the current standard of care, drug X can reduce the number of hospitalizations experienced and essentially improve blood glucose control. Then perhaps we want to go back to the payer's own setting and tie in some information about the number of hospitalizations that he typically sees with his patients that are currently being treated with the standard of care. So we're saying that he has 0.8 hospitalizations per patient annually. We have our 30% reduction with drug X, which means that hopefully for patients with drug X, we could anticipate a reduction of about 0.2 hospitalizations per patient, or 293 over the course of a year for his plan. Let's say in his setting, each hospitalization comes with a price tag of $5,600. Well, we can add that information to the reduction in hospitalizations and show that he can achieve substantial cost savings of just over $1.5 million. I just got a chat from somebody that they can't hear anything. Can everyone else hear okay?
I think you sound great.
Okay, great. So up until this point, everything has focused on the audience and what they're going to see, what they're interested in, how we're going to present the data to them. But of course, we also need to think about how we're going to structure the tool and set it up from the back end. And specifically, this is how we're going to set up the model. Now, when we develop models in-house and we know that a mobile tool will be the end use from the get-go, we can do this from the very beginning. But if we're using a model that wasn't developed with the end goal of being integrated into an app, then these are the typical steps that we would follow. So the first step is to remove any unnecessary content. So this might be the charts and other visualizations of the data that we are actually going to put directly on the user interface, or any sections of inputs and calculations that aren't needed for the tool itself. Then we might also want to look at reordering the content to follow the flow of the tool and color coding the cells according to their function. So generally speaking, we classify cells as inputs, calculations, and results. The inputs are the user editable values and selections that will be presented on the user interface. The calculations are not presented, but are of course are not presented, but are of course vital to making the tool work. And then the results are those that will be presented as numbers, as tables, or as charts. Now, some of the main challenges that we face when we develop mobile tools center on how to develop an impactful user interface and user experience. So, for those who aren't so familiar with these terms, the user interface is how the tool looks and feels. So this includes the branding, the color scheme, and the general impression that it gives, while the user experience is how someone experiences using the tool. For example, the navigation style employed, or how the tool responds to their activity, let's say when they click a button. So some of the things that we want to keep in mind are creating visual cues, keeping hierarchy clear, and adding icons representative of the messages that they describe. So it helps to create visual cues because they can signal what different types of content represent and guide the eye. This ties back to the concept of helping your audience to anticipate what's coming next. We want to keep alignment and styling consistent and use colors as codes or keys. For example, we might always use the same 3 colors to represent the 3 major cost types, or as we saw in the example value story, always use the same pink to represent the new drug. Closely related to this, we want to keep hierarchy clear. So where do we want the audience to look first? The way that we present and style content should facilitate this. For example, we might always put the value message at the top of the screen, the inputs on the left, the results on the right, and so on. And finally, it can help to add icons representative of the messages that they describe. So we should do this in moderation, of course, but they can, when used effectively, make for a more interesting and visually appealing experience. In terms of the user experience, or UX, the first thing we need to do is to make sure that it is optimized for the device on which the tool will be presented. So if the tool is going to be presented on a tablet or an iPad, then we need to make sure that all of the inputs and the interactive elements are large enough to tap with a finger, not a mouse, and that all of the text is big enough to read. We also want to honor negative space. This applies to documents, it applies to PowerPoints, it applies to Excel models, and it also applies to interactive tools. Generally speaking, less is more, or rather, the more blank or negative space you have on a page, the better. It helps to make sure that the content that is presented is clear and makes for a more enjoyable interaction. And finally, we want to optimize the navigation. And this is, of course, relevant both for the presentation device and for how we want our users to move through the tool. So we want to place controls in logical and obvious locations, and we want to make sure that they match the expected choices and movements that a user is likely to make as they go through the tool. What content are they going to want to interact with when, and how do we make sure that we help them get there in the most efficient way? So, we've developed a compelling value story. We've streamlined our content. We've followed the principles for an effective and impactful UI and UX. How do we make sure that our tool is actually used in the field? Well, the key to this is to engage users early in tool development. Bringing key users and country affiliates in to provide feedback on intermediate drafts can help to ensure that our tools are fit for purpose, that they include the content that our stakeholders are likely to deem relevant, and that they're set up to facilitate updates and adaptations in future. Knowing what content is likely to change and how can help you to design your tool to facilitate this from the get-go. This is particularly important, for example, if we know that we're going to translate our tool to another language. English sentences and words are quite short, whereas the same content in German, for example, would require much more space. If we know this from the beginning, then we can set up the interface to accommodate the increased text size. It's also extremely helpful at this stage to identify administrators. So these are the ones who would be responsible for championing tool rollout and also for acting as the point people for feedback and questions coming from the field. At Basecase, we actually have a built-in translation workflow that helps to optimize the process. So it's really very simple. It's a case of downloading the translation template, which is essentially an Excel file with all of the content from the tool, all of the words, all of the sentences. You can then translate this either in-house or using an agency, and then re-upload it to the tool. And all of the content is automatically swapped out with the new language. And then it's just a case of going through the tool, making sure that no content is truncated, that everything looks good, and so on. So we're almost at the end of the webinar, but before we wrap up, I'd like to look at how we can ensure that the tools we develop can withstand the almost constant changes that we see in medical and regulatory fields. So the first step is acknowledging that such changes are inevitable and setting up the tool to withstand them in the first place. For example, often we know that later down the track, some new treatments are going to be available on the market, in which case we want to structure the model and develop the interface with this in mind, so the new therapies can easily be added when the time comes. Of course, here we want to ensure that our model is well structured and appropriately color-coded so that whoever is making the updates has an easier time. Similarly, if our tool uses an library of assets, we want these to be well organized and to follow a consistent naming pattern so that they can be swapped out easily as required. Another consideration might be, for example, the branding or color scheme. Perhaps these are likely to change in the future. Maybe there's an acquisition on the horizon, in which case we want to make sure that we have a well-defined style guide in place that can be quickly updated as required. So I just have one last question for the audience before we wrap up. If we could go back to the Mentimeter, Suzanne. Perfect, and it seems, so what is your preferred method for tool development? Do you prefer to develop tools in-house? Do you prefer to outsource them to an external agency? Perhaps some combination of the two, or maybe you're not using mobile tools yet. Okay, so it looks like some combination of the two. Well, that is certainly an effective means to do it. I think that's probably all the responses we're going to get. If we could go back to the presentation. Thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of the webinar. I hope that you found it informative and interesting. And I hope that I was able to illustrate the potential of mobile tools, not only to engage payers and providers with interactive personalized content and present your product's value story in an impactful way, but also to foster field force engagement, to gain customer insights that can guide future material and tool development, and to maintain centralized control and version management, which of course can all lead to facilitating easy rollout and country adaptations and translations. And now I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Atlanta. As she mentioned, we'd love for our audience to go to the Q&A box in the lower right of your screen and enter your questions, and we will answer as many as we can. So, Atlanta, it looks like the first question came in. What is the biggest challenge that you typically face when developing mobile tools?
That's a great question. So this probably centers around the value story writing phase. So often we receive a beautifully structured, beautifully formatted, beautifully developed Excel model, and it's quite easy to kind of get stuck in the way that the content is presented there, how the inputs are ordered, the type of results that are being generated, and perhaps how it was set up is perfect for the intended use of an Excel model, but it might not suit the content that we want to put on an interactive tool. And so it's kind of breaking out of the mindset of the Excel model and finding a way to present the content in a way that's likely to resonate with the audience of the tool, who perhaps are only looking at the content for, let's say, 10 minutes versus perhaps the 30 that they might have with an Excel-based tool.
Got a question regarding adapting to other countries. How feasible is it to adapt models to other countries and markets, given that a number or maybe even all of the inputs would be expected to change? And then there's a second part. What previous experience do you have in this domain?
So I would say, generally speaking, it's very feasible to adapt models to other countries and markets. So in terms of specifically how we work with the base case software platform, we develop the core tool. Let's say it's for the US or Canada, and then we make a copy of that tool and update if it's just the values of the inputs, or updating perhaps the types of calculations are done, and releasing that version as the Spanish version or the French version that's suitable for that specific market.
Someone else wants to know, can you comment on any experience you may have on predictive modeling?
So I personally don't have any experience in this domain yet, but I know that my colleagues who actually are sitting also with me in the New York office do, so I can certainly ask them to reach out to you after this presentation, Felipe.
Someone else wants to know, what kind of mobile tool development services do you offer?
Mobile tool development services. So we offer basically a wide spectrum. We can do it all for you. So for example, you might send us your Excel model, your PowerPoint file, whatever content you wanted to put into the mobile tool, and then we would go through the phases of value story writing, storyboarding, model streamlining, and implementation of the content. And we would involve you for feedback and review, but we would typically do the implementation of the content itself. Or we can do a kind of hybrid model, for example, where we would develop a UI template or kind of get you started in the implementation and then hand it over to you. We would provide some training and support along the process, so you would be able to develop the tools yourself. For those who haven't seen or aren't familiar with the software platform that we have for developing mobile tools, it's using a drag and drop editor. So much like you would create a PowerPoint presentation, you can drag and drop content onto the interface, style it according to your brand and requirements, and connect it to an underlying Excel model. And it's very, very easy to use with some training.
Would you recommend that these tools be built in-house or sourced to agencies?
This depends a little bit on your time frame, on the resources you have available, on whether you want to commit to receiving the training and investing the time in building the tool yourself. Generally speaking, what we recommend is that providing it's suitable, you would use us to develop the first tool, for example, and then you would do the adaptations for different countries in-house, or perhaps you would use that first tool as the starting point to develop others. But yeah, all of the methods work. If for whatever reason you need to develop tools in-house, this is something that we would highly recommend doing.
Looks to be our last question from the audience. Why would you say clients choose base case over other alternatives?
So I would say the ease of adaptability versus other agencies, for example, that develop custom one-off tools. The fact that Basecase uses this drag and drop editor and it's essentially open to editing means that it's very easy to update content when new information becomes available, localize it for different markets. Perhaps you want a English and a French version for Canada. It's very easy to make two versions, and it would come at a fraction of the cost than you would have to invest if you were going to a one-off app vendor and having two separate apps developed.
Thank you so much, Atlanta, and thank you to our audience for their excellent questions. Before concluding the webinar, we have a few short announcements. The next webinar in the series will take place on December 11th. Roman Cassiano will present The Rare Disease Drug Dilemma, Great Value, High Price, Limited Access. Finally, our last webinar of 2019 will be on December 19th when Drs. Peter Kilford, Mien Zhang, and Janik Wadagadera will present What's New in the SimCip Simulator. You can register for all webinars in the series by visiting certara.com/webinars. On behalf of Certara, I would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. This concludes the webinar. Goodbye and have a great day.